She was barely 19 years old when she was sentenced to die in the most brutal way imaginable, bound before a crowd, surrounded by accusations, called a heretic, a witch, an enemy of the faith. The air around her felt heavier than usual, as if even the atmosphere itself was watching what was about to happen. The fire started slowly, almost quietly. First came the smoke, thick and suffocating, rising and curling through the air, half swallowing the young figure tied at the center of the execution. Then came the flames, small at first, almost hesitant, but growing fast, climbing the sides of the structure, closing in, consuming everything around her. The heat built with every passing second. The air grew thick, heavy, impossible to breathe. The crowd watched. Some prayed in silence, eyes shut. Others hurled accusations, as if they needed to justify what they were witnessing. And others just stared, completely still, wrapped in an uneasy quiet, as if they were standing in front of something they couldn't make sense of. Something that defied all logic, something that shouldn't have been happening this way. But the most disturbing part isn't her death, it's what came after. Years later, the very institution that allowed her execution declared this young woman a saint. The same woman who had been called a heretic was now venerated. How is that even possible? How does a person cross such an extreme line? Who was Joan of Arc, really? A messenger of God, or a threat that had to be eliminated? To understand it, you have to go back to the beginning. Joan of Arc was born around 1412 in Domremy, a small village tucked deep in the French countryside, an isolated, simple place, far from the centers of power, practically invisible to the political world, but deeply scarred by war. France was living through one of the most violent periods in its history. The Hundred Years' War wasn't just a conflict between kingdoms, it was a constant presence in everyday life. There were no safe borders, no stability, cities ransacked, fields destroyed, entire villages wiped out after fast, brutal raids, families torn apart. Fear was the background noise of everything, and no one could say when it would end. For the people who lived there, the war wasn't a historical event. It was daily life. Joan grew up in that world. The daughter of peasants, she learned hard work before she learned much of anything else. She helped in the fields. She tended the animals. She understood early that surviving mattered more than anything. There was no room for ambition, no room for dreams. Her future seemed written before it had even started. But there was one constant in her life: faith. Religion wasn't just a belief, it was a framework for the mind, a way of making sense of suffering, and the only way to imagine something beyond that hard, unforgiving world. Then something began to shift. At 13, Joan claimed she heard a voice. Not an internal thought, not her imagination. Something external, clear, direct, as if someone were actually standing right beside her, speaking to her. At first, she was terrified. She tried to ignore it. She tried to go on living her normal life. But it didn't work. The voice came back, and came back again, and again, until it became impossible to ignore. Over time, it stopped being just a voice. It became a presence. And then came the visions. According to Joan, these weren't ordinary figures. They were sacred. The Archangel Michael, Saint Catherine, Saint Margaret. These presences didn't just appear. They communicated. They delivered messages. And those messages had a clear direction. Save France. Bring the rightful king to his throne. Change the fate of an entire nation. For anyone living in that era, this was impossible to accept. A teenage peasant girl, no education, no connections, no standing in society, claiming to have been chosen by God. The reaction was predictable. Some laughed, others ignored her. Some thought she was out of her mind. Others thought she was something dangerous. But there was something about Joan that was hard to dismiss. It wasn't just what she said, it was the way she said it. Absolute conviction, not a trace of doubt. The sense that, for her, this wasn't a possibility, it was a certainty. At 16, Joan made a decision. She left her village, alone, without protection, without guarantees, and she set out to find her way into the political power of France. Her goal was simple in theory and impossible in practice. Get to the king, But that wasn't something within reach for a peasant girl. She was turned away again and again, ignored, mocked, treated like she didn't matter. But she didn't stop. Something inside her wouldn't let her. After a long stretch of persistence, doors began to open. Not because of political merit, but out of curiosity and mounting pressure. She was finally brought before the court. King Charles VII agreed to hear her out. What exactly happened in that meeting was never fully documented, but the outcome was decisive. The king believed her, and that changed everything. Joan was given armor, she was given weapons, she was given soldiers. A young woman with no military background was now at the center of a real war. But the most remarkable thing wasn't that. It was the effect she had. Seasoned soldiers began fighting with more courage, as if something invisible had shifted the air around them, as if defeat no longer felt inevitable, as if something had woken up hope. And then the victories came. Orléans was liberated, other key cities were reclaimed. France, which had seemed on the verge of collapse, began to push back. The impossible was happening right in front of everyone. For many it was a miracle, but for others it was something far too dangerous to be allowed to continue. Because to the English, Joan wasn't a hero. She was a direct threat, and threats like that get dealt with. So a new narrative began to take shape, a campaign to destroy her image. She wasn't sent by God. She was a witch, a heretic, someone manipulated by dark forces. The war stopped being just military. It became psychological, spiritual. And in that kind of fight, truth stops mattering. What matters is control. With her victories, Joan helped secure the coronation of Charles VII, but that also marked the beginning of her isolation. Political support quietly started to fall away. Allies drifted off. She was left increasingly exposed. And then came the capture. No protection, no army, no real backing. She was taken by her enemies and put on trial. What followed wasn't a trial in any honest sense of the word. It was a process built to convict her. The charges were many: heresy, blasphemy, lies, deception. The interrogations were relentless, long, psychological, designed to wear down her mind and her faith. The goal wasn't to find the truth, it was to make her take it all back. But that never happened, even under extreme pressure, even staring death in the face. Joan held her ground, right to the end. For months she was held prisoner, in harsh conditions, dark, cold, under constant surveillance. Some accounts say she was kept in chains. Despite being young, despite being a woman, the objective was clear: break her. Time was used as a weapon, silence as pressure, solitude as part of the punishment. But even then, she didn't give in. At one point, they offered her freedom if she denied her visions. A psychological trap. She refused, because doing so would have meant denying her own mission. On May 30th, 1431, in Rouen, the sentence was carried out. Joan was brought to the stake, bound, exposed before a crowd. Some watched in silence. Others shouted. Accusations rang through the air. The flames began, slow, rising, consuming. The heat built. Smoke filled the air. And according to historical accounts, she repeated just one word: Jesus, over and over, until the very last moment. And then, silence. Her body was burned a second time after the execution, to prevent any kind of veneration. Even her ashes were thrown into the Seine. The goal was to erase every trace of her, as if she had never existed. But it didn't work, because history doesn't end with death. Years later, the case was reopened, the trial was reviewed, and the conclusion was clear. Joan had been unjustly condemned. Centuries later, her image was completely transformed, from enemy of the faith to national symbol of France. And in 1920, the Catholic Church made a historic decision. Joan of Arc was canonized. The same young woman burned as a witch was now recognized as a saint. Today, her story still divides opinion. For some, she was a messenger of God. For others, a piece on a political chessboard far bigger than herself. And some believe we'll never know the full truth. But maybe the most important question isn't who Joan of Arc was. It's what was really speaking to her.